Welcome back, brothers and heretics, Grimhammer. Tonight we're discussing the theory of Guilliman, possibly knowing the Emperor is becoming the Dark King. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for support. I've been absolutely killing it. Now, let's get into the madness.
There were hours in the sanctum when even the engines of the palace seemed to hold their breath. Robert Guilliman had learned to hate those hours more than the alarms of war. When the strategium hololiths were dark, when the astropaths had been dismissed, when the endless petitions of priests, generals, cardinal envoys, and trembling adepts had at last fallen silent beyond adamant doors, there remained only the quiet. Not peace. Never peace. The imperial palace had not known peace since the age of heresy bled its madness into the bones of terror. What remained was a hush like that inside a mausoleum, the stillness of a cathedral built over an open grave. In that stillness, a man might think. In that stillness, a Primarch might remember. In that stillness, the Lord Commander of the Imperium was left alone with truths too poisonous to utter. He stood before a great window of armoured crystal and looked out across the toxic night of holy terror, where the spires of 1,000,000 shrines clawed at the heavens like the fingers of the drowned. Processional lights moved below in endless rivers, vast pilgrim trains winding between fortress basilicas, reliquary towers, sepulchral administratum hives, and the gun-crowned bastions of the throne world. Every lumen, every chant, every tolling bell was bent toward one name. Father. No. Not Father. Emperor. Not even that, if one wished to scrape away the layers of incense and liturgy and behold the thing as it had been. He had once been a sovereign of reason, a tyrant of impossible vision, a master builder who had despised superstition even as he manipulated it in others. He had thundered against gods. He had sought to starve the warp by denying it the oldest currencies of sentient life: fear, worship, surrender, awe. He had raised the Imperium upon the blade-edge creed that there were no gods, no demons, no sacred mysteries, only enemies, lies, and powers unnamed which a disciplined species might master through will. That truth had died. It had not merely failed. It had been butchered, rendered down, fed into the furnace of civil war, and recast as its opposite. The imperial truth was a corpse. The imperial cult stood upon its grave, vast and triumphant, clothed in gold and bone and martyr fire. Every world Guilliman had reclaimed in the Emperor's name burned with devotion. Every fleet that crossed the void bore chapels swollen with prayer. Every trench line, every manufactorum, every plague-choked shrine city and ash waste and hive stack screamed praise to the being interred upon the golden throne. And the bitterest cut of all was this: the prayer seemed to work. He had returned to life expecting lies. He had expected fraud, opportunism, state-managed sanctity, priestly manipulation draped over the machinery of empire. He had found all of that, and more. He had found greed investments, ignorance enthroned as doctrine, and whole populations taught to kiss the chain that bound them. He had found an imperium that had taken his father's dream and crucified it upon its own altar. Yet amidst the corruption, amidst the bloated madness of cathedral state and death cult and sanctioned hysteria, there had been too many moments that would not submit to dismissal. Too many saints who should have died and did not. Too many visions shared by souls separated by void years and circumstance. Too many battlefields where the impossible had descended like a sunless dawn and driven back horrors no mere mortal faith should have checked. Too many reports from trusted commanders. Too many sealed testimonies from astropaths left blind and bleeding by a radiance that had no right to exist. Too many incidents in which the immaterium had recoiled from a single name, spoken with genuine, desperate belief. Too many times that he himself had felt it. The pressure, the regard, the vast and unbearable attention from beyond the skin of reality. It was not constant. Were it constant, madness would have been mercy. It came in flashes, in those moments when history narrowed, and 1 billion lives leaned toward catastrophe. Then Guilliman would feel, through all the layers of armor and flesh and engineered pride that made him what he was, the brush of an intelligence seated somewhere beyond the range of ordinary thought, not dead, not sleeping, not absent, watching. Sometimes, though he loathed himself for the admission, it seemed to answer. He had stood within sanctums where the air thickened with ozone and sanctity until mortal men collapsed weeping. He had heard confessions from sisters of battle whose wounds had been mortal until they were not, from navigators who swore the beacon in the warp had flared with a wrath that was almost personal, from remembrancer scholars and ordo savants who came before him pale and shaking with fragments dredged from sealed archives of the Scouring, the Siege, the Regency of Malcador, the first founding schisms, the secret chambers beneath the palace where history had been mutilated for reasons of state. None of it offered certainty. None of it assembled neatly. But truth in the Imperium had never arrived as a complete thing. It survived in scraps, in contradictions, in marginalia left by dead hands, in testimony extracted under pain, in censored dispatches, in the things men mentioned only once before, pretending forever after that they had said nothing at all. That was how the darkest realizations came, not in proclamations, in patterns. Guilliman was made for patterns. He saw them as other beings saw constellations or wounds or the faces of saints in smoke. Supply, morale, contagion, obedience, rebellion, adaptation, myth, exhaustion, devotion. An empire was not a thing one ruled by slogans. It was a living calculus of belief and force. And when he turned that pitiless faculty upon the Imperium as it now existed, the conclusion that emerged from the data was one he could scarcely endure. The Emperor was growing, stronger. Not stronger in any manner that could be measured by reactor output or fleet tonnage or divisions mustered under arms. Stronger in the way powers of the warp became strong. Stronger in the way storms gathered sentience around a gravitational center of emotion. Stronger because mankind suffered. Stronger because mankind adored. Stronger because trillions cried out to him not as sovereign, not as ancestor, not even as protector, but as divinity. The dependence of the species upon the throne had become absolute. The sacrifice never ceased. The offerings never ceased. Blood, fear, ecstasy, martyrdom, hope, sharpened into fanaticism, despair made useful by ritual, every agony sanctified and directed upward into the dark. The four great powers fed upon excess, decay, rage, and ambition. That was the old lesson, the poisoned lesson, the lesson his father had tried to hide beneath secular law and military order. Yet what was worship, sustained over 10,000 years by pain and need and species-wide psychic surrender, if not another path to the same abyssal architecture? The thought alone was treason beyond measure. No, beyond treason, beyond heresy. It was the kind of idea that could unmake civilization. To suggest that the God Emperor of mankind was not merely a god in the minds of the faithful, but was in truth becoming a warp sovereign, born of human adoration and sacrificial dependence, would break more than doctrine. It would shatter categories on which the Imperium itself depended. Priest and inquisitor alike would either deny it with homicidal frenzy or embrace it with apocalyptic joy. Sector would turn upon sector. Creed would divide into 1,000 screaming sects. Some would proclaim the final vindication of the ecclesiarchy. Others would see only the most obscene irony in the history of the species, that the great enemy of godhood had become the greatest god of all. And worse than all of that was the possibility that both sides would be right. Guilliman closed his eyes and saw the chamber on Macraga, where his father had spoken to him through a mouth that was no longer a mouth, through a presence fractured by scale and ruin and purpose, too immense for speech. It had not been reunion. It had been contact with something wounded and incandescent, a being stretched between corpsehood and omnipotence, between sovereignty and imprisonment. He had emerged from that encounter with no comfort, only certainty that the Emperor remained active, and that whatever remained upon the throne was no inert relic. He remembered too the hidden fragments, forbidden allusions in palace vaults to the last days of the siege, half-burned transcriptions, whispered scholarship on a possibility once feared above all others. A king of ruin, a crown of the immaterium shaped by human catastrophe, an apotheosis not of triumph but of cosmic damnation. The phrase differed from archive to archive, degraded by censorship and devotional rewrite, yet the shadow of it persisted. A thing narrowly averted, a name never meant for prayer. The implication was monstrous, that at the height of the heresy, amidst the slaughter of terror and the collision of material and warp, the Emperor had not merely fought to save mankind from Horus. He had fought to prevent a metamorphosis within himself. Had he turned aside from that precipice only to approach another over the abyss of millennia? That was the question Guilliman could not silence. Not whether the Emperor was divine. That word had become useless. Divinity was what frightened children and enthralled priests. The real question was functional, metaphysical, imperial. What was the throne doing to him? What was mankind doing to him? What shape did a being assume when fed not by the passions that birthed the abominations of the Empyrean, but by obedience, dependence, veneration, grief, zeal, and the industrialized sacrifice of an entire species taught from birth that salvation wore a human face? Enthroned in death, he knew better than most what warp entities were. They were not simple personalities. They were concentrations of meaning made hungry. They were principles with appetites, vastnesses generated and sustained by repeated emotional acts across the history of sentient life. If enough minds yielded enough of themselves in the same direction for long enough, reality eventually answered. The Imperium had been answering for 10,000 years. Cathedrals were not merely buildings, they were psychic architecture. Pilgrimage was not merely devotion, it was the motion of souls along prescribed lines of surrender. Martyrdom was not merely example, it was energy invested with narrative, made contagious through memory and rite. The black ships, the soul tithe, the choir fires of sanctioned psychers, the million daily deaths offered in service, the ceaseless intonation of litanies on a million worlds, all of it fed the same central absence presence upon terror. The species had become an engine of invocation so vast that no tyrant, no saint, no demonologist had ever intended or imagined its equal. And in the center of that engine sat the Emperor. Guilliman opened his eyes. The lights of terror trembled beneath a veil of industrial haze. Somewhere far below, massed congregations were chanting the evening offices. He could not hear the words through the armored crystal, but he knew them. Every child in the Imperium knew them. Every soldier whispered them over failing weapons. Every voidsman mouthed them as the Geller fields shuddered. Every mother taught them beside corpse-starch stoves and shrine niches and habbunk altars. Faith was no longer an ornament draped over the Imperium. Faith was its circulatory system, and that more than any archived fragment or saintly impossibility chilled him. Because if the Emperor had once sought to deny mankind to the warp, then mankind had answered by binding itself to him with a devotion so total that it had created a new path into the immaterium. Not the old roads of the Four, not rage, not indulgence, not despair, not change. Something colder, more disciplined, more absolute. A sovereignty built from duty transmuted into worship, from obedience raised to species law, from suffering made sacred because it was endured in his name. A human god, a god of empire, a god of sacrifice, and perhaps in the end, a god no less terrible for being mankind's own. No one else in the Imperium could be permitted to think this clearly. That was the final cruelty of his station. There were inquisitors learned enough to brush against the truth, but they were creatures of reflex, bred to answer terror with purgation. There were cardinals subtle enough to sense the contradiction, but they would celebrate it. There were scholars in hidden cells of the palace who had assembled pieces of the pattern, yet lacked the authority to act on anything so ruinous. Only Guilliman possessed both the breadth of sight and the power to understand the consequence of speech. So he said nothing. He let the priests preach. He let the choirs sing. He let the banners of the ecclesiarchy stream across worlds reclaimed in blood. He made use of the faith he mistrusted because to tear it down now would not restore reason. It would only leave an empire of addicts screaming in withdrawal while the enemies at the gate tore out its throat. Silence had become a burden heavier than armor. At times he wondered whether his father knew this, whether the being upon the throne had foreseen that the last loyal son returned to rule would be condemned not merely to defend a crumbling imperium, but to guard the secret at its heart. Not a comforting secret. Not some hidden assurance that the emperor was preparing salvation in radiant mystery. Something worse. Something that made every miracle suspect, every prayer transactional, every shrine another brick in a monument to metamorphosis. Guilliman rested one gauntleted hand against the crystal and stared out over the largest graveyard in human history. If he was right, then the Imperium was not waiting for the return of its god. It was making him. And if it was making him, then the most catastrophic truth in human history was not that the Emperor had become divine. It was that Robert Guilliman believed he was becoming something far more dangerous, and that the survival of mankind might depend upon never allowing the Imperium to understand what it had begun. There were names that did not survive into liturgy. That, more than any decree of the Inquisition, or any redacted shelf in the hidden vaults beneath the palace, told Robert Guilliman how dangerous such names had once been. Mankind remembered what it was permitted to weaponize. It forgot what it had nearly become. The Imperium was vast beyond thought, but its memory was selective in the manner of a wounded beast. It preserved glories, sanctified defeats, and hammered disasters into parables fit for priestly mouths. What it did not preserve, save in splinters and sealed fragments, were the shapes of roads not taken when those roads led somewhere too terrible for doctrine to endure. The Dark King was one such shape, not a saint's title, not a demon's common cognomen, not some florid scrap of apocrypha invented by hive mystics and gutter prophets. Guilliman had encountered it where the oldest truths survived in damaged form, in the half-burned edges of testimony, in sealed memoranda from the last delirious hours of the siege, in records so thoroughly buried that only a Primarch with command of Terra's deepest vaults could even suspect they existed. The term itself shifted from source to source, as all things did when passed through fear, censorship, and 10 millennia of pious mutilation. But the meaning beneath the corrupted phrasing was hideously consistent. It had been a possibility, not merely a threat issued by the powers of the warp in their eternal mockery. Not a boast, a possibility in the strictest and most dreadful sense. A terminus, a final state toward which the heresy had strained, as though all its blood, betrayal, devotion, and rage were tributaries feeding a single black ocean, a new sovereignty in the immaterium, a fresh and supreme concentration of power, not born from alien excess or ancient Xenos corruption, but from the catastrophe of mankind itself, from the collision of empire, faith, despair, and apocalypse at the very seat of human dominion. The revelation mattered for reasons far beyond horror. It meant the Emperor had not spent the last days of the heresy fighting on only one front. All the sanctioned histories, all the grand and simplified retellings, all the painted catechisms in basilica domes and scolum halls, rendered the struggle into terms even frightened minds could follow. Horus the arch-traitor, terror besieged, the Emperor confronting his fallen son in the final reckoning. This was true, as far as all such stories were true, yet it was not complete. The old fragments implied something larger and vastly more unsettling. The master of mankind had not merely contested Horus. He had contested a transformation taking shape within the architecture of destiny itself. The issue at stake had not been only victory or defeat, nor even the survival of the species, but the question of what kind of god might be born from humanity's ruin, if the war reached its full and final consummation. God. Guilliman despised the word, yet there was no cleaner one. His father had never treated divinity as a metaphor, never in any era worth taking seriously. Others had mistaken his rejection of worship for evidence that he did not believe in gods. That had always been the misunderstanding of lesser minds. The emperor denied godhood publicly because he understood too well what it meant in truth. He knew the warp was not a theatre of myths, but a predator realm in which thought, emotion, ritual, and belief could accumulate into vast intelligences. He knew that species-wide psychic conduct had consequences. He knew that worship was not harmless error, but metaphysical surrender. He knew, above all, that if enough sentient life bent itself toward the same fear, the same ecstasy, the same dependency, reality would eventually answer in forms too monstrous to control. That was why he had preached denial with such iron severity, not because gods were unreal, but because they were real enough to starve or to feed. And so the possibility of the Dark King revealed the deepest terror hidden beneath all the public certainties of the Great Crusade. The Emperor had not been trying simply to extinguish superstition as a philosopher corrects ignorance. He had been acting as a man who knew precisely what waited on the far side of mass psychic catastrophe. He feared godhood because he understood it as a state of being with material consequence, warp consequence, civilizational consequence. Not an honor, not an accolade, a disaster condition, a total metamorphosis with the power to rewrite the fate of species. Had he feared that condition in others alone, Guilliman no longer believed so. The scraps from the siege suggested something colder, something more intimate. The Emperor had feared becoming the doom he wished to prevent, humanity's fifth damnation, not the Prince of Rage, nor the Lord of Rot, nor the ravening excess of appetite, nor the labyrinth of mutability and scheme. Something else. A tyrannical psychic monarch enthroned upon the surrender of an entire species, born from war without end, devotion sharpened by terror, and despair made useful through obedience. Not salvation descending from above, but sovereignty condensed from all the agonies mankind had poured skyward for relief. A god of empire in the most poisonous sense. A god of command, sacrifice, hierarchy, and binding need. A god that would not tempt men to sin so much as teach them to sanctify their chains. The Siege of Terror had been the perfect crucible for such a thing. No battle in human history had ever approached its scale of psychic concentration. Whole continents burned. Billions died within the span of weeks and then days and then hours as the noose tightened around the throne world. Every scream, every oath, every prayer, every vow of vengeance, every act of sacrifice, every murder committed in hatred or ecstasy or holy duty fed upward into an Empyrean already storm-mad with the predation of the Four. The walls of reality had worn thin beneath the pressure. Time itself had staggered. The palace became at once fortress, temple, grave, and ritual site. The warp flooded close enough to stain matter. Demons did not merely intrude then, they overlapped. The boundary between material and immaterial was not broken cleanly, but frayed into ribbons and dragged through the blood mud of terror until no one standing within that apocalypse could claim to inhabit an untouched reality. Such conditions did not simply permit revelation, they generated it. That was the secret coiled in the meaning of the Dark King. Guilliman had come to believe it was never only a person awaiting birth somewhere beyond the veil, some throne occupant predestined by name and face. It was a station in the order of nightmare. A role reality could open under the right pressures. A crown hammered out of species-scale catastrophe and set upon whichever being stood at the nexus of sufficient power, symbolism, and psychic gravity when the hour ripened. A vacancy that might be filled, an aperture in fate awaiting the correct conjunction of slaughter, belief, command, and metaphysical mass. Under such a reading, the Emperor's final choices upon terror acquired a grim coherence that no pious simplification could ever capture. He had not merely been trying to kill Horus and save the palace. He had been trying to avoid ascension under the worst possible conditions imaginable. The wrong apotheosis, the wrong hour, the wrong geometry of ritual and ruin, chaos favored, chaos circled, chaos fattened by the unmaking of his dream and the reduction of the Imperium's secular foundations to ash. If he had crossed that threshold then, at the fevered pinnacle of the siege, what would have emerged might still have borne the memory of the Emperor, but it would have been shaped by every corrupt pressure surrounding the birth. Humanity would not have gained a god in victory. It would have birthed a warp sovereign in the middle of its own butchery and called the result deliverance. The thought made Guilliman's transhuman flesh crawl. It also explained the strange contradiction at the heart of the old records. The Emperor had resisted, yet not renounced the possibility that lay beyond resistance. He had stepped back from one brink, but the fragments nowhere proved that he had rejected all forms of transcendence forever. That was the nuance no priest would tolerate and no simple chronicle could carry without detonating into madness. To refuse one apotheosis did not mean refusing all apotheosis. It might mean only that the conditions were unacceptable, the timing wrong, the authorship intolerable, the birth polluted. A ruler might decline a poisoned crown and still intend, in some darker future, to claim another. That possibility had become the iron shard lodged in Guilliman's thoughts since his return. He walked now through an imperium that fed the throne with a fervor no age of the Great Crusade had ever known. The heresy had drowned terror in unprecedented death, yes, but it had lasted years. The imperium of the present age had been screaming devotion for 10,000. The Emperor's name was no longer a command issued by central authority across a still rationalizing empire. It was the devotional reflex of trillions, world after world, generation after generation, death after death, martyr after martyr, fleet after fleet translated into the warp under choirs chanting his titles, soldiers advancing through shellfire with prayers cracked through blood, void crews pinning votive bones to Auspex consoles, children taught before all else that the corpse upon terror watched, judged, preserved, demanded. Every war zone became a chapel. Every shrine became an engine. Every sacrifice entered the same invisible account. At times, Guilliman wondered whether the scale of modern faith had surpassed even the psychic violence of the siege, not in intensity, but in endurance. Terror had been a cataclysm. The Imperium was a system. One had blazed white-hot and near-terminal. The other had burned slowly for millennia, converting misery into sanctity with industrial precision. If the Dark King had been a role reality might open beneath certain conditions, then the present age had not dispelled those conditions. It had distributed them, standardized them, turned them into civilizational practice. Was that not, in its own way, more dangerous? He recalled audiences in the Hall of Leng, reports from battle fleets reduced to ruin yet preserved by what officers could only describe as impossible providence, testimonies of saints walking through melter fire, astropathic choirs laid low by visions of a throne blazing brighter than a star collapsing inward, confessions from inquisitors who had spent whole lives hunting warp corruption, only to admit, in chambers sealed against all recording devices, that the Emperor's interventions now exhibited an agency no mere lingering psychic reflex could explain. The corpse endured, the will endured, the acts multiplied, the cult deepened, the paradox widened. If the Dark King had been narrowly avoided upon terror, what precisely had been prevented? Immediate birth corruption of form capture by the Four. Or only the premature emergence of something the Emperor intended, in another shape and under sterner terms, to become later. Guilliman hated that last line of reasoning. It smelled too much of design, too much of retrospective patterning forced upon chaos by minds desperate for order. Yet, he could not dismiss it. The Emperor had always operated on scales almost no other being could withstand. He had concealed truths as a matter of statecraft. He had sacrificed tools, sons, and entire populations to protect long trajectories invisible to those below him. If anyone in the history of mankind might seek to delay a divine metamorphosis until it could be undertaken on terms favorable to himself rather than to the pantheons circling for carrion. It was the emperor of mankind. But delay had a cost. The cost was this age. This realm of reliquaries and corpse candles and crusades without terminus. This imperium that called itself eternal while feeding upon the bodies and belief of its own people. This species-spanning machine of prayer, grief, dread, and submission, all directed toward terror as though by instinct. Guilliman could not tell whether mankind had accidentally built the slow answer to the crisis once feared in the siege, or whether some measure of that outcome had always lurked beneath the foundations. What he did know was simpler and uglier. The fear the Emperor never explained had not vanished. It had merely changed tempo. Once it had gathered in a single age of civil war, with terror as altar and the traitor host battering at the last walls of reason. Now it gathered as custom, sacrament, attrition, and need. Once it had threatened to erupt in a moment of absolute psychic overload. Now it ripened through repetition. Once the possibility had worn the immediacy of apocalypse. Now it wore the patience of empire. Guilliman stood often in chambers where the Astronomican's soul light vibrated through the stone like a second heartbeat, and tried to imagine what his father had seen in those final days. Not only Horus enthroned in treachery, not only the breach of the webway dream, not only the loss of sons and armies and all the rational architecture of the Great Crusade. He tried to imagine perceiving, through all that ruin, the shape of a throne in the warp, waiting to be occupied by the right kind of human catastrophe. A dark crown forged from devotion and despair, a destiny that would not simply kill the Emperor, nor even only damn mankind, but enthrone humanity's own suffering as a new principle in the cosmos. Had he recoiled from it then, or recognized in it a tool too dangerous to grasp until later, that was the question. The only question, perhaps, that mattered beneath all others. For if the Dark King had been truly defeated, if that aperture in fate had been sealed forever by the Emperor's refusal at terror, then the present age was merely a grotesque imitation of old dangers, survivable in the same miserable way the Imperium survived all things. But if the Dark King had only been denied one birth, if the role had remained open, if the pressure of 10,000 years of prayer and sacrificial obedience had begun to shape a slower and more stable road toward the same black coronation, then mankind had not escaped the nightmare of the heresy at all. It had only stretched that nightmare across 10 millennia and taught itself to kneel while it ripened. There were truths in the palace that did not sit in vaults, nor in cogitator crypts, nor beneath seal and sigil in the custody of the Inquisition. They lived instead in absences, in the shape of decisions that had never made sense when judged by the catechisms of a simpler age, in the careful placement of contradiction deep within structures that were supposedly built for unity, in the old, cold realization that only a fool looked upon the Imperium's first foundations and mistook them for innocence. Robout Guilliman had ceased believing in innocence long before the heresy. After his resurrection, he ceased believing in accident. The old lie was comforting because it rendered the age of betrayal into tragedy. A father loved his sons. A glorious empire was advancing toward inevitability. Then pride, jealousy, wounded vanity, and the predations of the warp twisted that dream into fratricide. It was the sort of story lesser men preferred because it preserved the emotional order of things. Virtue had been betrayed. Trust had been broken. Disaster had come from without and within, unforeseen by those noble enough to suffer it. Yet the Emperor had never ruled through nobility of that kind. He had ruled by architecture, by pressure, by contingencies nested within contingencies, by sacrificing one certainty to secure another further down the line. Guilliman knew this not merely because he had seen enough of his father's handiwork to understand its scale, but because he himself had inherited some pale portion of that same instinct. No empire spanning the stars was built on hope alone. It was built on reserve granaries and duplicate commands, on chains of authority that could endure decapitation, on cultures shaped not only by ideal but by stress testing. Any sovereign with sense built redundancies. But the Great Crusade had possessed more than redundancies. It had possessed fractures arranged so artfully that, in retrospect, they looked less like oversights than prepared fault lines. The legions had never been equal in temperament, doctrine, or social function. That alone was natural enough. Different wars demanded different instruments, yet the degree of deliberate incompatibility was harder to ignore the more one studied it without piety. Entire warrior cultures had been fashioned around instincts that could not peaceably endure one another forever. Some were built for occupation, some for annihilation, some for compliance, some for terror, some for civic absorption, some for punitive spectacle. Their Primarchs were made with virtues sharpened so close to flaw that each seemed destined to become a danger under altered circumstances. Pride elevated into destiny, zeal honed into inflexibility, secrecy ripened into paranoia, ferocity into blood hunger, discipline into cold contempt, vision into obsession. As sons, they were a family only by the broadest and most sentimental measure. As state assets, they were an unstable pantheon. That had always troubled Guilliman. In the days of the Great Crusade, he had forced the concern into rational terms. The galaxy was vast, compliance complex, and each Primarch served a specialized purpose in an age of rapid conquest. But death, defeat, and 10,000 years of hindsight had stripped away the last comforts of that explanation. Diversity of function was one thing. A machine seeded with this many mutually destructive principles was another. He stood in a forgotten hall beneath the inner reaches of the palace, where the air was dry as parchment and tasted faintly of old machine oil and sanctified dust. Servo skulls drifted between stasis-shielded alcoves, bearing records so prescribed that the men entrusted with their maintenance had been rendered mind-blank and tongueless. On a lectern of black iron rested a projection slate, its runes dim, its contents accessible only by his gene-sealed authority. The fragments before him were incomplete, as all worthwhile things in the Imperium were incomplete. But he no longer needed completeness. The pattern had become visible years ago. Now he merely returned to it the way a man returns to an old wound, probing to see whether it still hurts. It always did. The Emperor had never been blindsided by rebellion, as ordinary fathers are blindsided by disobedience. That was the childish reading. He knew too much of human nature, too much of conquest, too much of history, and too much of the warp to believe an empire forged at such speed and through such violence would pass untested into tranquility. If he had truly expected endless unity after the Crusade, then he had been madder than any priest dared imagine. But the Emperor was not mad, ruthless, secretive, arrogant beyond measure, yes, yet never foolish in that particular way. Conflict had been expected. That truth reached Guilliman in no single clean declaration. It emerged through implication, through Malcador most of all. The Sigillite, even in old preserved testimonies and half-erased exchanges, revealed more by what he spoke around than by what he stated outright. There had been intimations, scattered and maddening, that the broad shape of internal war was known, that some fracture among the Primarchs had been accounted for within strategic possibility, that the timetable, not the event itself, had been the true disaster. Chaos had not invented the weakness. It had struck earlier, more violently, and with greater mastery than the throne's hidden architects intended. Guilliman could still remember the first time he let that implication settle fully in his mind. Not rebellion unforeseen, rebellion anticipated. Not a father betrayed from innocence, a sovereign preparing for controlled combustion. It explained too much, the favoritism and neglect, the silence on matters too dangerous to leave unexplained. The Primarchs crafted as much from raw psychic and psychological magnitude as from genecraft. The legions allowed to grow around their father lords into warrior civilizations so extreme that some would never adapt to peace. The bizarre permissiveness shown towards certain pathologies, so long as they remained useful against the enemy without. The toleration of monsters while monsters were needed. There was precedent for this colder reading, and it was written in blood on the soil of old Earth. The Thunder Warriors had won the world for unification. They had broken tyrants, crushed techno-barbarian empires, and raised the Emperor upon the first rung of his ascent. They had also been unstable, violent, and unsuited to the future he desired. So they had been used, celebrated, and removed. Not all at once in public denunciation, not with the ritual honesty of a lawful discharge, but through attrition, engineered irrelevance, and final extinction when their purpose was spent. If the Emperor could do that to the first army of his making, then only sentimental fools believed the legions sacred in his eyes. Tools, some more beloved than others perhaps, some more closely aligned to his own impossible standards, but tools nonetheless. And what were tools in the hands of such a maker, if not things to be expended so that the work might endure? The thought had once disgusted Guilliman. Now it merely clarified. The Primarch project itself began to look different when seen in that light. Not a fraternity intended to govern peacefully together forever, but a concentration of extreme human potentials deliberately magnified into demigods to achieve the conquest of the galaxy at speed. Once that conquest neared completion, what then became of such beings? Could Angron be retired into magistracy? Could Kurz be trusted in the long peace? Could Lorgar accept a secular order forever stripped of the worship he craved? Could Perturabo be allowed to go on measuring his worth against slights real and imagined while commanding engines capable of unmaking civilizations? Could even Horus, magnificent and fatal Horus, remain merely first among equals once the great labor of conquest had been completed and a more administrative age began to crowd him? The answer was not encouraging. Perhaps the Emperor had known that from the beginning. Perhaps some suns had always been meant to become combustible, some legions expendable, some bloodletting inevitable. Not because the Emperor delighted in family murder, but because he was capable of treating the family itself as a temporary political arrangement in service to species' destiny. A controlled heresy, if that dreadful phrase could even be permitted in thought, might have offered brutal advantages. It could purge unstable elements that would never submit to a settled imperium. It could shatter the overmighty military power of the legions before they became permanent feudal empires unto themselves. It could justify the centralization of authority around Terra at the very moment the Emperor moved humanity toward its next stage. It could burn off the most dangerous contradictions within the machine while preserving the core, a civil purge masquerading as tragedy. The notion was so monstrous that only the Emperor could have conceived it as reasonable. Guilliman could imagine the logic because he despised it. That was the inheritance he hated most from his father, the ability to see how a monstrous plan might still count as efficient statecraft. Even now, in the dark reaches of the 41st millennium, he was forced almost daily to sacrifice worlds to save sectors, to trade millions of lives for months of strategic delay, to accept atrocities of necessity because the alternative was extinction. But necessity acknowledged was one thing. A design laid generations in advance was another. That smelled not of desperate command, but of species-scale vivisection. And yet the evidence refused to yield to pity. The empire of the Great Crusade had been too full of controlled instability to dismiss. Rivalries were not merely tolerated, they were sharpened. Knowledge was distributed unevenly with surgical intent. The warp was denied in public, while being fought in secret by orders that could not possibly have been intended as permanent improvisations. The Webway project was hidden from the very sons whose campaigns bought it time. The imperial truth itself, so rigid in proclamation, functioned as both doctrine and muzzle, starving humanity of explanatory language even as the real enemy gathered behind the veil. It was as if the Emperor believed he could manage every contradiction through timing. Hold this one in ignorance, feed that one ambition, delay disclosure here, offer honor there, let pressure build, then vent it when the structure was ready. But timing failed. That was where the true disaster began. Chaos did not merely exploit rebellion, it took command of it. What might have been intended as a managed internal war, bounded and brutal and politically useful in the most horrific possible way, became instead an inferno that consumed the center. The gods of the warp did not wait politely for the Emperor's chosen hour. They reached into the weaknesses already present and ripped them open before the palace was prepared, before the webway dream was secured, before the unstable suns could be isolated on acceptable terms. Horus was not simply turned. He was elevated into a spear aimed at terror with a speed and fury that transformed strategic cruelty into near-species suicide. The controlled burn became a galaxy fire. That was the great miscalculation, if miscalculation it was. The Emperor had always believed himself master enough to use terrible things without becoming their victim. He had used barbarism to unify terror, used gene-forged killers to conquer the stars, used secrecy to keep mankind moving forward without panic, used lies to starve older nightmares. Why not use civil war as well, if civil war could serve a further purpose? Why not accept the destruction of some suns to secure the species? Why not wield even catastrophe as instrument? Because catastrophe had other claimants, because the warp was not inert. Because to build a crucible of betrayal and blood on that scale was to invite forces far older and hungrier than human strategy to lean close. Here the fear of the Dark King slithered back into Guilliman's thoughts, joining itself to the heresy in a way he could no longer separate. If the war had been intended in some darkened chamber of foresight as both trap and purge, then the Emperor cannot have meant it to culminate in godbirth. He must have believed he could harvest the political necessities of internal conflict without allowing the Empyrean to crown the disaster with metaphysical consequence. He would take the purge, perhaps, take the centralization, take the cleansing of unstable elements, but not the final transformation, not the black coronation waiting beyond sufficient slaughter and enough concentrated human anguish. That had been the line he meant never to cross, and yet the line had come under his feet all the same. Guilliman looked down at the projection slate, at the dimly flickering script of dead adepts and sealed witnesses, and felt again that old hollow chill behind the sternum. The Emperor may have allowed the heresy because he feared something worse than civil war, worse than fratricide, worse than the loss of suns, legions, worlds, and the dream of a rational imperium. He may have judged those losses acceptable when weighed against another future in which mankind drifted helpless into psychic awakening under the feast hunger of the warp. If so, then the heresy was not permitted out of blindness, but out of dreadful choice. And if that was true, then the last consolation died with it. For the future, he feared, had not been slain on terror, only delayed. Guilliman knew that now, with the bleakness of a thing learned too late. The war had happened. The purge had escaped all control. The species had survived, maimed and howling, into an age of worship. And in that age, the same deeper danger gathered once more, no longer as sudden revolt, but as 10,000 years of prayer, sacrifice, and submission bent toward the throne. If his father had once risked civil war to prevent a darker destiny, then all that risk, all that blood, all that calculated horror might have bought nothing except time. Time for mankind to build the same doom more slowly and call it faith. The truth of the Primarchs had always been hidden behind the lie of their splendor. Even in the age of victory, when banners of compliance rose over dead worlds, and the iterators still believed history could be disciplined into reason, Roboute, Guilliman had sensed the deformity buried beneath the magnificence. Not with the clarity he possessed now, and not with the bitterness that 10,000 years of ruin had hammered into him, but with the faint strategic unease of a mind that saw systems as they were rather than as they wished to appear. The Primarchs had never made sense as mere generals. They were too much for that, too singular, too unstable, too laden with symbolic gravity. To cast them as supreme commanders, gene-forged lords built only for conquest, was to explain the blade while ignoring the furnace that birthed it. They had been made to conquer, yes, but they had also been made to matter. That was the part the old secular myth could never comfortably account for. If the emperor had desired only war leaders, he could have fashioned war leaders by less perilous means. He had the science. He had the gene law of old Earth, the vaults of the Himalaya, the corpse wisdom of dead ages, and the breeding vats of Luna. He could make armies. He could make transhuman kill beings by the 100,000. He could carve tactical genius into flesh. The Legiones Astartes themselves proved that. Even diminished from the impossible template of their sires, they were sufficient to break Xenos empires and drown continents in disciplined violence. Why then go further? Why make demigods? Because demigods were not only military assets, they were statements made in flesh. They were engines of destiny. And somewhere in the secret history of their making, there lay the taint of the warp. Guilliman hated that conclusion with the same cold intensity with which he knew it to be unavoidable. The old stories surrounding the Primarch project, where they survived at all beneath strata of censorship and devotional nonsense, did not read like the record of clean science. They read like the aftermath of trespass. There were hints of hidden journeys, of impossible gates, of transgressions committed in places where no mortal law held weight. The Emperor had reached beyond the bounds of accepted material craft. Whether he stole fire from the Empyrean, defied powers older than species memory, struck some bargain he believed himself strong enough to escape, or simply forced his way into mysteries no human being was meant to touch, the result had been the same. Something had been taken. Something had been shaped. Something had been brought back. And the gods had answered. Not openly then, not with the vulgar theatricality of later demon wars. The retaliation had worn the face of chance, as the warp so often preferred when it wished to mock the arrogance of planners. The scattering of the infant Primarchs had long been taught as sabotage, a single act of malice by hostile powers seeking to wound the Emperor through theft and displacement. That explanation was not false, it was merely incomplete. Guilliman no longer believed the scattering had been only the spiteful abduction of favoured sons. It had the uglier character of a debt called due. The Emperor had taken from a realm of appetite and symbol. The realm answered by breaking the vessel of his intention and hurling its contents into the dark. There was almost a grim symmetry to it. If the Primarchs had been crafted in part through means that borrowed from the warp, then to scatter them through the galaxy was not merely to inconvenience their father, it was to expose each one to shaping influences suited to his overcharged nature. Not random exile, but directed corruption by environment, pressure, myth, suffering, culture, deprivation, and worship. Each son was cast not into simple misfortune, but into a furnace matched to his latent extremity. Barbarism found the barbarian, oppression found the rebel, devotion found the zealot, darkness found the judge, hunger found the devourer. Guilliman himself had been fortunate, or perhaps merely assigned a form of testing more subtle than chains and butcher's nails. MacGregor gave him order, administration, purpose, and restraint. Yet even that was a kind of shaping. It gave the Empire Maker to the son who would one day become its most dutiful custodian, and perhaps its most tormented witness. He thought often, in those blacker hours beneath the palace, that the Primarchs had not truly been scattered across worlds. They had been planted in ideological soil, planted where each might become not merely a warrior, but the magnified embodiment of some human drive sharpened beyond safety. That was what the Emperor either failed to understand or understood too well. His sons were not balanced beings, they were concentrations. Every virtue in them existed so close to monstrosity that the dividing line was little more than circumstance. Sanguinius carried nobility so refined it became tragic sacrament. Dawn bore duty until it calcified into a living fortress. Russ was loyalty armed with sanctioned savagery. Perturabo was wounded mastery transmuted into siege-born hatred. Lorgar was reverence seeking an altar whether ordered to kneel or not. Kurz was judgment stripped of mercy and left to stalk in midnight skin. Angron was pain made incarnate until all reality was measured against the relief of killing. Fulgrim was perfection so desperately pursued it could only end in violation. Magnus was aspiration untethered from humility. Horus was kingship swollen until the galaxy itself became too small for the wound in his pride. And Guilliman was order. Order to a scale that could become domination without ever needing to call itself such. Reason hardened into administrative empire. Restraint coupled to colossal capability. The instinct to build systems vast enough to survive their makers. Even his gift, when stripped of its civic dignity, carried the possibility of nightmare. He knew that now. Knew it with a clarity that younger versions of himself would have called cynical. The Primarchs were not simply sons with strengths and flaws. They were human potentials exaggerated to the edge of metaphysical significance. Not symbols after the fact. Symbols from inception. That was why they mattered to the theory that gnawed at him. If the Primarchs had been forged partly through warp-touched means, then they were never truly secular beings, no matter how sternly the imperial truth denied such categories. They were not creatures of laboratory and genome alone. They possessed the weird density of things that meant more than their matter should allow. Men broke around them. Cultures reorganized around them. History accelerated in their presence. Space Marines did not merely obey them. They oriented themselves to them with a fervor that bordered on liturgical before the galaxy had found the language to admit what it was doing. Wherever a Primarch strode, narrative thickened, fate drew close. Entire civilizations bent as if before a gravitational force not wholly explicable by charisma or military command. Such beings were dangerous far beyond the battlefield. They were fracture points. Guilliman had come to suspect that the Emperor knew this from the beginning. That was the most chilling possibility of all. Not that the Primarchs became hazardous by accident, but that they were designed as instruments powerful enough to crack history open if required. Tools of conquest, certainly, but also nodes through which the species might be dragged towards some greater transition. Each could hold a legion, each could anchor a myth, each could embody an entire logic of rule or destruction. Each stood close enough to the warp in essence, if not always in conscious practice, that reality around them took on the tautness of a drawn blade. There were those in hidden scholastica and among the madder theologians of forbidden circles who muttered of the Primarchs as shards, splinters, reflections, partitioned emanations of a greater being. Guilliman despised such simplifications. They were mystical, laziness masquerading as insight. His brothers were not clean fragments of a divisible soul. They were not tidy portions of paternal essence that might be slotted back together by an allegorist's hand. They were far more dangerous precisely because they were whole enough to act and narrow enough to become monstrous. Separate wills, separate hungers, separate certainties, each over-amplified along one or more axes of human possibility until the result ceased to be merely personality and became historical pressure. That was why their collisions had never been merely familial quarrels. When Primarchs opposed one another, worlds buckled. When their convictions clashed, civilizations died. When one fell, entire metaphysical economies stirred in answer. Weapons first, sons second. It was the ugliest sentence Guilliman had ever allowed himself to form about his father, and once formed, it could never be banished. He alone among his surviving brothers perhaps possessed the discipline to endure that conclusion without either collapsing into worship or lashing out into denial. Lionel Johnson would turn such knowledge inward into older silences and colder ferocities. Russ would snarl and break rather than anatomize. Vulcan would grieve it as betrayal. Corax would take it as one more poison in a universe of poisons. But Guilliman could do what Empire demanded. He could look at horror and continue the calculation. He could acknowledge that the Emperor loved in the fashion of a sovereign, which was to say, only insofar as love did not interrupt utility. It sickened him. It also explained everything. The Primarch project was too hazardous, too grand, too symbolically charged to have been undertaken without an awareness of its possible consequences. The Emperor knew he was fashioning demigods. He knew those demigods would not fit easily into a peaceful human future. He knew they might become catalysts for schism, myth, and metaphysical upheaval, yet he made them anyway. Why? Because perhaps he believed humanity would need more than armies. Perhaps he believed it would one day need a god. The thought came to Guilliman rarely, for it was among the darkest of them all. But when it came, it did not arrive as a burst of madness. It settled with dreadful composure. What if the Emperor's hatred of godhood had never been hatred in the simple moral sense? What if it had been strategic horror at a necessity he wished to postpone until he could define its terms? What if the Primarchs were not merely generals for a secular crusade, but preliminary organs in a much larger design? Tests, vessels, proofs of concept, an experiment in binding transcendent force to engineered flesh and sovereign purpose. Not apotheosis achieved, but apotheosis rehearsed. That would explain the scale. That would explain the risk. That would explain why theft from the warp, or defiance of it, or some bargain too obscenely complex for mortal record had been deemed acceptable in the creation of the Emperor's sons. He was not just building a military aristocracy. He was feeling toward a future in which human power could stand in the same ontological category as the gods he despised, not to worship them, to replace them, to supersede them, to make of mankind a species that no longer cowered before the immaterium, but generated its own answer to it. The Primarchs failed, if that had been the dream. Or perhaps they did not fail at all. Perhaps they merely revealed the price. Guilliman stood beneath the weight of old stone and the older silence of the palace, and understood, with the bleakness of one who can neither unknow nor confess, that the Primarch project had never been only a work of gene science. It had been the first impossible trespass, the first great gamble, the first moment in which the Emperor reached beyond human measure and dared the warp to contest his right. Everything after had unfolded from that crime: the scattering, the rivalries, the heresy, the hunger of the gods, the long enthronement, the species-wide dependence on a single divine center. The road had begun there, in the making of the suns, not as a detour from apotheosis, as the first true step toward it. There were some dead men whose silence weighed more heavily upon the Imperium than the proclamations of living saints. Malcador was one of them. Roboute Guilliman had come to hate the old regent in the precise and disciplined way only a son of Macragga could hate a man he had also come, against reason, to respect. There had been no softness in Malcador, the sigillite, no grandfatherly warmth fit for the shrine paintings of later idiots, no harmless wisdom wrapped in frailty. He had been iron hidden in withered flesh, a keeper of necessary poisons, a patient architect of concealment who had spent his life arranging realities too dangerous for ordinary minds to endure. He had lied as a matter of policy. He had sacrificed truth as readily as other men sacrificed troops. He had stood at the Emperor's side not because he was kind, but because he possessed the same monstrous gift in smaller measure, the ability to look upon vast human suffering and ask only whether it purchased survival. That was why his implications mattered. Not his words alone, for Malcador's words were always layered, always built to reveal and mislead in the same breath. It was the shape beneath them that mattered, the pressure of meaning, the grim contour left behind when his fragments were aligned against the old official narrative and found not to support it, but to crack it open. Guilliman had read enough, heard enough, cross-referenced enough sealed testimony and private recollection and damaged vault transcripts to understand the core of the thing. The crisis had not been that rebellion happened. The crisis had been that it happened before the Emperor was ready. That single shift in emphasis deformed the whole moral skeleton of the heresy. Tragedy remained a tragedy when disaster came from unforeseeable weakness, from love betrayed, from loyalty poisoned by forces too subtle or ancient to guard against entirely. There was grief in that model, there was pathos, there was even nobility if a man needed such lies to keep his pulse steady. But if rebellion had existed within the Emperor's strategic horizon from the beginning, if internal conflict among the Primarchs had been expected in broad outline, if the true catastrophe was not division itself, but the premature seizure of that division by the warp, then the heresy ceased to be merely a family disaster and became something far uglier. Failed statecraft, not on the scale of kingdoms or sectors, but on the scale of species destiny. That was the revelation hidden inside Malcador's burden. He had not simply spent his life keeping ordinary secrets from the unready. He had helped manage a controlled scenario whose intended boundaries had ruptured. He had watched the Emperor prepare for a future involving fracture, purge, and consolidation, only for that dark design to be ripped out of human hands and swallowed by something immeasurably older and hungrier. His secrecy, then, was not the pious discretion of a loyal servant preserving his master's dignity. It was the secrecy of a man who knew that the official history was not just incomplete, but structurally false. It told the story mankind needed, not the story that had happened. Guilliman could almost admire the cruelty of it. Almost. He walked often through the hidden galleries beneath the innermost palace where the oldest records slept under layered wards, and there he could feel Malcador's ghost more vividly than in any sculpted shrine or embalmed legend. The regent lingered, not as a soul, for the warp devoured such things according to its own obscene arithmetic, but as a pattern of governance, a residue of method, one falsehood nested in another, one omission serving three strategic purposes, one truth broken into fragments and hidden in separate vaults so that no single theft could recover the whole. This was how Malcador had thought, not as a scholar seeking clarity, but as a jailer of dangerous meanings. And the most dangerous meaning of all was that the Emperor's grand design had always depended upon timing. Timing of revelation, timing of suppression, timing of war, timing of transformation. The Emperor had not built his species project as a straight road. He had built it as a sequence of doors meant to open in a particular order. Terror unified first, the stars reclaimed next, the secular creed imposed as shield and muzzle, the webway made secure, the psychic future of mankind managed, guided, perhaps even domesticated, beneath a single sovereign will, before the great awakening of the species could occur in a manner useful to the warp. That, Guilliman believed, was the nearest thing to mercy his father had ever intended. Not freedom exactly. Never that. The Emperor did not believe in freedom as ordinary men understood it. He believed in direction, in command, in imposed advancement. Humanity was to become something greater, but under his hand and not under the predation of the Imperium. A controlled psychic future. That was the dream concealed beneath the secular one. Not a humanity forever blind to its own nature, but a humanity shepherded into psychic maturity under circumstances the Emperor controlled. No gods, no cults, no catastrophic surrender to the old powers, no species-wide awakening delivered into the jaws of demons. He would master the transition himself, and in doing so deny the warp its feast. It was almost admirable in conception. It was also indistinguishable from species-scale tyranny. Malcador must have known that, must have known the entire plan rested on a scaffold of half-truths so unstable that any major fracture would bring the whole architecture down. The Primarchs did not know enough. The legions knew less. Even the loyal sons marched through the Great Crusade as weapons denied the full map of the war they were really fighting. Guilliman had once taken pride in his ability to function despite incomplete information, to build systems even when the design was concealed from him. Now he saw that skill for what it had always been, usefulness to a father who compartmentalized truths because truth itself was treated as a strategic contaminant. And then came Magnus, and Horus, and the ruin of the webway. There, at last, the schedule shattered. Magnus had been fashioned for sorcery whether the Emperor admitted it or not. A mind too vast, too luminous, too hungry for hidden architecture to remain content within the borders of denial. Horus had been made for command on a scale that all but invited temptation. The Webway project, meanwhile, was the hidden hinge on which everything turned. Secure that passage, sever mankind's reliance on warp travel, reduce exposure, centralize movement, choke the gods of one of their richest avenues of influence, and the Emperor might yet have dragged the species into a safer age by force. Delay the internal fracture until after that foundation was complete, and perhaps even a civil purge among the legions might have been survivable, terrible but bounded. But Magnus broke the gate in his desperation and vanity. Horus was taken before the loyal structure was ready to absorb the blow. The hidden war became open disaster before the throne's hand had finished arranging its pieces. What had been intended, perhaps, as controlled brutality became reactive survival. The Emperor was dragged from authorship into crisis. That mattered more than any public chronicle could bear to admit. It meant the heresy was not merely the story of chaos seducing a favored son. It was the story of chaos forcing the pace, reaching into a plan already steeped in secrecy and moral horror, then accelerating it until every containment failed at once. That was the true brilliance of the enemy, if brilliance was the word for predatory instinct sharpened by ageless malice. The gods did not invent the contradictions of the Imperium. They simply struck them before the Emperor could convert them into something useful to himself. And in that acceleration lay the deepest terror of all. For if the Emperor truly feared being thrust into godhood under hostile conditions, if he understood that the wrong concentration of slaughter, despair, devotion, and psychic pressure might crown him in a form shaped by the warp's own appetite, then the Siege of Terror became not just a military apocalypse, but the exact metaphysical crisis he most needed to survive without fully ascending. He had to endure. He had to fight. He had to prevent Horus from winning. He had to hold reality together long enough to deny the Four a final coronation born from human ruin. He had to refuse the poisoned throne even while seated upon another. That was what made Malcador's implications so venomous in Guilliman's thoughts. They suggested not only that the Emperor had expected fracture, but that he had expected to ride it towards some further human destiny, not into the arms of chaos, but through the furnace of conflict and into a new order under his control. The true disaster was not that this ambition existed. The true disaster was that the ambition lost control of time. The enemy moved first. The enemy moved harder. The enemy turned sequence into collision. Yet ambiguity remained, as it always did with Malcador. Guilliman would have welcomed certainty, if only so he could hate it cleanly. But the sigillite had left no confession worthy of the name, no unambiguous testament reading thus: this was the plan. This was the intended purge. This was the acceptable blood cost. This was the future your father would have imposed upon mankind. Instead, there were hints, angled remarks, burdens shared only in fragments. The haze of intent surrounding every preserved piece was itself enough to drive lesser minds into doctrinal convulsions. Malcador spoke like a man who had spent too long holding together truths that could not survive exposure to daylight. Even his honesty arrived disguised. For Guilliman, that was enough. He did not need complete proof. Complete proof was for magistrates, for iterators, for those still childish enough to believe history ever offered itself whole. A Primarch of order required only sufficient coherence, enough shards to trace the outline of the vessel that had broken, enough admissions and absences to understand that the official tale was a mask nailed over a mangled face. And what a face it was! An Imperium possibly built atop concealed sacrificial design. A father who may have intended to shepherd humanity into psychic dominion through secrecy, force, and staged catastrophe. A regent whose greatest labor was not preserving truth but rationing it. A civil war that became an civil extinction crisis because the timetable slipped from human control. A siege that threatened not merely the throne world, but the metaphysical shape of mankind's future. Guilliman stood with these thoughts in the darkened arteries of the palace and felt the old hatred rise again. Not bright and hot, but glacial. He hated what his father may have intended. He hated what Malcador had hidden. He hated most of all that the evidence had reached the point where denial was no longer discipline, only cowardice wearing scholastic robes. The official history endured because it had to, but he had seen enough to know it was still only a mask. The first thing Rabaut Guilliman understood, truly understood, when he returned to Terra was that the Imperial Palace was no longer a palace at all. It was a tomb with artillery. It was a reliquary spread across a continent and armed like a star system. It was the last mausoleum of a species too terrified to admit that it had long ago transformed grief into governance. The walls still rose in cyclopean majesty. The bastions still bristled with lance batteries, macro emplacements, void shield cathedra, and the innumerable hidden violence of the throne world. Processions still moved through its sanctified arteries. Custodians still walked in gold beneath archways older than memory. Adepts still scratched decrees into parchments the length of banners. Generals still climbed its steps to kneel before the machinery of empire. But underneath all that continuity, the place had changed in essence. It no longer housed power. It orbited a corpse and called that condition order. Guilliman had entered the sanctum of the Golden Throne with all the iron of his gene-forged mind locked in place, prepared to endure the sorrow of seeing his father reduced to ruin. He had expected pain, fury, perhaps even the bitter steadiness that comes to soldiers when a long-feared truth finally manifests. What he had not expected was revulsion mingled with awe so absolute it made even his transhuman senses recoil. The thing enthroned at the center of mankind's dominion was less a man than the memory of a man pinned to a machine, vast enough to wound reason. Flesh clung where flesh could still cling. Bone endured where all softer matter had surrendered to age, war, and the obscene ministrations of the mechanisms that kept him tethered to the realm of the living. Incense and ozone fought a losing war against the odors of sanctified decay.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
Choirs moaned in the distance like dying engines. Light bled from conduits, sigils, relays, pylons, and soul-caged devices whose functions had long ago escaped the full understanding of the men who worshipped them. And yet, the thing was not dead. That was the blasphemy at the center of the Imperium. Not that a corpse sat the throne of the species, but that the corpse still exerted will. The Emperor had become more powerful in death than he had ever permitted himself to appear in life. Guilliman longer knew whether that truth should be called tragedy, vindication, or the final proof that mankind lived inside a paradox too immense for honest speech. In life, the Emperor had denied worship, suppressed revelation, and caged human understanding behind the brutal utility of the imperial truth. In death, or something so close to death that language became dishonest around it, he blazed through the warp as beacon, judge, sanctuary, weapon, and devouring center of a faith so large it had become indistinguishable from climate. The palace reflected that change in every stone. What had once been the command citadel of a conquering species was now the sacred heart of a sepulchral civilization. The banners hanging from its galleries were no longer merely heraldic. They were votive. The processions no longer moved as instruments of state, but as blood moving through the veins of a cathedral corpse. Everywhere there were bones, candles, censers, preserved hands of martyrs, reliquary, skulls, robes stitched from the skin of dead confessors, prayer strips nailed to ammunition crates, icons mounted on tank hulls, shrine niches carved into the supports of landing pads, chapel cells nested inside the walls of barracks and listening towers and munitorum archives. Faith had not spread through the Imperium as enlightenment. It had spread as infection. It had taken root wherever fear opened the flesh of society. It moved through grief, through war, through starvation, through plague and invasion, and the long attrition of being human in an age that rewarded only obedience and endurance. One world burned, and refugees carried its saint litanies to the next. One regiment survived impossible odds and turned its battlefield prayers into doctrine. One child saw a miracle, or thought she did, and soon a hive district bent itself around the report. One martyr died screaming the emperor's name, and in the retelling that scream became a sacrament, so the cult metastasized, so it passed from trench to shrine, from shrine to fleet, from fleet to frontier colony, from frontier colony to hive spire. It moved not because it was true in any clean philosophical sense, but because it answered the need of a species trapped between annihilation and madness. That had always been the true horror of it. The Emperor had not wanted humanity to understand what awaited the soul in the warp. Guilliman was certain of that now, not because his father was merciful, but because knowledge itself was combustible. To know what truly lurked beyond death, what feasted, what lingered, what dissolved, what screamed, what survived in forms better called torment than continuation, would have been to crack the species open. It would have birthed a panic no empire could long endure. Men would seek gods more frantically, not less. They would rush toward cult and bargain and demonic consolation. The Emperor's silence on the fate of souls had therefore been more than doctrine. It had been concealment on a civilizational scale. He had denied the language of the divine because he knew too well what desperate creatures did when presented with a universe in which damnation was not metaphor. But concealment had consequences. Humanity was not made less religious by terror. It was made more dependent. Strip away clear understanding, deny the old names, close every honest road into metaphysics, and still the fear remained. It had to go somewhere. In the end, it had gone to him. All the dread that should have splintered into 1,000 devotions, all the desperation that might have driven mankind into countless lesser hells, had been concentrated around a single point. Politically, it stabilized the Imperium. That much Guilliman could never deny. The cult bound impossible distances together. It gave starving worlds a common language. It taught soldiers to die facing the same direction. It gave generals, priests, navigators, voidsmen, laborers, and kings one shared center of gravity in a civilization too vast to hold by law alone. Yet politics was only half the equation. The cult also fed him. That possibility had ceased being speculation in Guilliman's mind and hardened into something nearer to conviction. Every shrine, every prayer, every ritual self-mortification, every martyrdom, every sanctioned burning of heretics, every hymn roared across a battlefield, every desperate mother begging the master of mankind to spare her child, every astropathic soul sent shrieking into the choir flames, every regiment marching to destruction under icons of the throne. All of it did more than preserve discipline. It flowed upward. It became pressure. It became attention. It became psychic mass directed with astonishing uniformity toward terror. There lay the truly monstrous shape of the Imperium. Not merely a state, not merely a military machine, a devotional engine so vast that suffering itself had become a fuel source. The Empire did not just endure pain, it converted pain into momentum. Billions lived and died in misery, but that misery was wrapped in ritual, framed as sacrifice, sanctified by catechism, and directed toward the same enthroned center. The species bled in patterns. It suffered liturgically. It died with names on its lips. That was what made the machine so powerful and so hideous. Random anguish was one thing. Sacralized anguish, endlessly harvested, was another. The Golden Throne stood at the center of this harvest. Guilliman had tried, in the first centuries after his resurrection, to think of the throne as life support, because life support suggested containment. It suggested a mechanism preserving what otherwise would have failed. It suggested a ruler clinging to existence by ancient artifice while his empire rotted around him. It was a bleak image, but still comprehensible. He no longer believed it sufficient. The throne was too many things at once. A cocoon, perhaps, within which something ancient and wounded changed according to laws no longer reducible to biology. An anchor, certainly, pinning a vast presence to terror and holding the Astronomicon alight against the madness of the Empyrean. A prison as well, for whatever remained of the Emperor's older self might be bound there against release, against dissolution, against ascension, against the final momentum of the thing he was becoming. A conduit beyond doubt, for the mechanism drank lives and translated soul force into continuance. And an altar above all, because all the Imperium treated it as one and may thereby have made it so, in fact. What then was enthroned there? A dying ruler, or a gestating warp monarch? The question sickened Guilliman, because he could no longer dismiss it as rhetorical excess. The symmetry was too precise to ignore. The great abominations of the warp fed upon emotion and excess. Rage, corruption, ambition, sensation, despair, transformation. They fed because sentient beings gave themselves over to those conditions in enough numbers and with sufficient intensity to stain reality. The Emperor, meanwhile, was fed by worship, by sacrifice, by dread sublimated into obedience, by martyrdom, by a species-wide fixation on survival through him and through nothing else. The currencies differed in surface character, but the underlying process bore an intolerable resemblance. Repeated emotional acts, ritual concentration, narrative reinforcement, psychic dependence, the slow thickening of an idea into a presence vast enough to shape the universe in return. If that were true, then the victory at Terra had been poisoned at the root. The Emperor would have won the war against secular collapse only by becoming the center of a new metaphysical dependency. He had denied the gods, and in doing so perhaps forced mankind to create a greater one. He had sought to starve the warp, and instead the Imperium now fed a human divinity on a scale no Xenos cult, no demon world, no elder civilization in its decadence had ever equaled. Guilliman found that possibility not merely disturbing, but obscene. It rendered the entire post-heresy order into a trap with golden walls. The species had escaped immediate damnation by kneeling itself into another form of it. He thought of the countless shrines across the stars, shrine worlds with their pilgrim oceans and catacomb bazaars, hive altars slick with tallow and blood, cathedral warships whose gun decks shook with prayer before broadside engagement, fortress monasteries, scholar chapels, manufactorum incense towers, crypts where the dead were stacked in orderly rows beneath saint statues and purity seals. The Emperor was present in all of them, not merely in doctrine, but in hunger, in expectation, in the invisible exchange by which belief sought protection and was rewarded, just often enough, by something undeniably active staring back through the veil. That was what Guilliman could not forgive, not the faith itself. Men were weak and afraid and surrounded by nightmares. They would always seek a master of the dark, but that it worked, that it seemed to answer, that impossible survivals, holy manifestations, bursts of soul fire, interventions at the brink of annihilation, all suggested not simply a fading psychic reflex from a dying lord, but a being growing more immediate through the very worship once forbidden, a being not ending, a being accumulating. There were nights upon Terra when the chant of the pilgrims rose like heat through the palace foundations, when the whole mountain of stone and metal and sanctified death seemed to vibrate with the burden of adoration. On those nights, Guilliman would stand alone in some armoured gallery and imagine the throne not as the life-support cradle of a murdered sovereign, but as the chrysalis of something history lacked the courage to name. He would imagine all the misery of mankind streaming upward in threads of gold and ash and scarlet, every prayer, every wound, every pyre, every child given to the black ships, every guardsman bleeding out in mud while whispering a final catechism, every confessor teaching that pain was holy if borne in the Emperor's sight, every world offering its dead, every fleet making translation under hymn and incense. 10,000 years of it, no interruption, no true rival, no release. Could anything fed so long by such unanimity remain only what it had been? Or was the Imperium witnessing, in reverent slow motion, the birth it believed it was preventing? That was the ugliest thought of all, and therefore the one Guilliman found hardest to banish. Perhaps the God Emperor was not standing sentinel against the rise of a human chaos god. Perhaps he already was that rising, stretched across millennia, so that mankind could kneel through the transformation and mistake the labor pains for salvation. When Roboute Guilliman first opened his eyes to the age that had inherited his father's empire, his earliest sensation was not triumph, nor even anger. It was estrangement. He had expected ruin. Any mind still capable of reason would have expected ruin after 10,000 years of attrition, invasion, schism, greed, mutation, and institutional rot. He had expected territorial collapse, administrative distortion, and the long corrosion that time visited upon all human designs. He had not expected sanctity. That was the first great shock. Not that the Imperium had decayed, but that it had decayed into a church. He had been born into a project of conquest, wrapped in the hard language of secular destiny. The Emperor had denied gods with the cold impatience of a man who saw worship as weakness and revelation as a weapon best kept from lesser hands. Even when hypocrisy gnawed beneath those proclamations, even when the warp lurked behind censored doctrine and silent orders, the public shape of the empire had still been rational in posture. It marched beneath banners of unity, compliance, law, remembrancer, truth, and species purpose. It had spoken in the iron voice of inevitability. What rose to greet Guilliman instead was a cathedral state built from relics, martyrdom, and holy terror. Everywhere he looked, there were bones. Bones in glass shrines. Bones sewn into vestments. Bones mounted in the prows of warships and beneath the aquilae of tanks. Bones stacked in charnel chapels, where the faithful knelt by the million. The dead had become architecture. Memory had become liturgy. War had become sacrament. Every corridor of every major command citadel seemed to contain a shrine niche. Every office, no matter how supposedly practical, had its saint candles, prayer strips, devotional seals, incense censers, and framed scraps of sanctified script. Battle plans were drafted beneath icons. Fleet routes were blessed with oils and blood. Tithe records were stamped beneath the eyes of martyr statues. Fortress walls bore litanies as often as range markings. Even the silence of the Imperium had been transformed. It was no longer the silence of ordered command, but the hush of a sepulchre in which the dead were believed to listen. He remembered the first time he saw great rivers of pilgrims on Terra after his return. Not troops, not petitioners. Pilgrims. Millions of them, flowing between bastions and basilicas in rags, chains, ceremonial masks, or funeral white, carrying icons, dragging reliquaries, weeping, chanting, cutting themselves open before shrine gates to mix their blood with the dust of the throne world. There was nothing rational in it, nothing efficient, nothing of the clean imperial order he had spent his first life helping to build. And yet that endless mass of devotion was not peripheral to the Imperium. It was central. The faith did not merely accompany power. It generated it. It bound worlds that law alone could never bind. It taught starving multitudes to endure conditions reason would have judged intolerable. It made armies hold when logistics had failed. Worlds submit when terror alone would have birthed revolt, and officials obey even when corruption had eaten every nobler motive away. That was the poison at the center of Guilliman's awakening. He despised what the faith revealed about the Imperium's collapse, yet he could not deny its utility. The ecclesiarchy was a monument to failure. It was proof that the imperial truth had died, that his father's great public creed had not simply cracked, but inverted. Every cathedral spire thrust into the heaven smog of terror, every confessor shrieking before the mustering of regiments, every relic procession winding through plague-stained hab zones, every death cult, saint cult, bone market, and martyr litany testified to the same defeat. Mankind had not become rational. It had become desperate. It had not outgrown gods. It had built the largest one imaginable around the carcass of the sovereign who told it not to kneel. And still Guilliman could not destroy the cult. He understood that truth almost at once, and understanding it was among the loneliest moments of his second life. There were many institutions he could discipline through force, many worlds he could compel through a mixture of terror, reform, and strategic mercy. Many old corruptions he could excise with bolter, decree, and execution writ. But the ecclesiarchy was not merely an institution in the ordinary sense. It was the nervous system of the late Imperium. Tear it out, and the body would not recover. It would convulse, it would thrash, it would likely die screaming. Abolish the cult, and whole sectors would erupt in holy panic. Pilgrim worlds would riot. Shrine worlds would declare him Antichrist in all but name. Cardinals would denounce him. The Inquisition would fracture. Guard regiments raised on hymns and relic oaths would not all obey a Primarch commanding them to abandon the faith that had carried their mothers and fathers through the dark. Planetary governors already balancing on rotten. Foundations of fear and need would turn upon one another in the vacuum. Civil war would not be a possibility, it would be a certainty. Guilliman knew the arithmetic of empire too well to indulge in purity. He could not burn out the faith without burning out the Imperium. That knowledge sat inside him like a lodged blade. His tolerance, therefore, was not acceptance. Never acceptance. It was paralysis imposed by scale. Strategic paralysis. The faith was too deep, too total, too old, and too effective to excise without inviting a catastrophe beyond even his immense capacity to manage. So he endured it. He endured cardinals bowing before him as though he were some angelic relic of a sacred age. He endured processions staged in his honor. He endured sermons that turned his father into a sun god of sacrifice, and Guilliman himself into a living testament to divine will. He endured the stink of incense in war rooms, the muttered catechisms before orbital insertions, the shrine economies, nested parasitically inside every administrative organ of the state. He endured it because he had no choice. Yet endurance bred suspicion. For the longer he governed this nightmare empire of his father's corpse, the more often events occurred that he could not lay cleanly at the feet of propaganda, fraud, mass hysteria, or selective reporting. Guilliman had come back expecting miracles to be the language of weak minds interpreting coincidence through hunger. He still found plenty of that. There was no shortage of lies in the Imperium, no shortage of priests willing to hammer mundane survival into spectacle, and every battlefield anomaly into proof of divine favor. But there were also incidents he could not reduce. Too many. A saint who walked where no flesh should have endured. A burned-out astropath choir describing the same throne fire from opposite edges of a subsector. A fortress line moments from annihilation spared by an empiric recoil that left sanctioned psychers vomiting, blood and speaking, in terrified fragments, of a will that was not theirs. A void ship dead in the warp finding sudden passage as its captain led the crew in prayer with the certainty of a drowning man who expected no answer and received one. Guilliman did not trust miracles. That was precisely why they frightened him. He began, in the black privacy of his own thoughts, to regard the ecclesiarchy less as a corruption imposed upon the emperor from without, and more as the machinery through which the emperor was changing. That was the darker reading. Priests liked to imagine themselves as guardians of a pre-existing truth. Guilliman had come to suspect they were laborers in a process none of them understood. Every sermon, every shrine, every relic tour, every mass prayer, every martyr festival, every sanctioned hymn bellowed across a war-torn continent might be doing more than preserving social order. It might be feeding a metamorphosis. The cult was not merely draped over the throne, it was plugged into it. That idea only sharpened the clash between Guilliman's own nature and the reality he was forced to govern. He was built for systems, for inventories, hierarchies, codifications, reserve structures, logistics, fleet dispositions, legal reform, strategic partition, civic restoration, and all the countless moving parts by which civilization was prevented from tearing itself apart faster than war could manage. Give him a crumbling realm, and he would redraw its arteries. Give him shortages, and he would rebuild supply. Give him administrative corruption, and he would set auditors upon it with the patient ferocity of a siege master. He understood empires the way great predators understood flesh. But the imperium he inherited could not be managed by reason alone, because it no longer obeyed reason alone. He could reorganize crusade fleets, and still the captains would ask for blessing rites before translation. He could standardize tithes, and still whole. Populations would endure shortages, only because confessors promised the emperor saw their suffering. He could issue precise legal restrictions on excesses of shrine taxation, and still governors ignored him when local saint cults had more authority in the streets than any charter. He could try to impose sober command discipline on war zones, and then watch as a single unexplained act of battlefield grace undid a month of rational messaging because belief spread faster than memorandum ever could. That was the true humiliation of it. The Imperium believed because belief worked, not always, not reliably, not with the neat repeatability of machine law, but often enough to become self-reinforcing. Often enough that even skeptics used the language of faith when the void screamed and the hull buckled and reality itself seemed to peel back from the gunmetal skin of the ship. Often enough that the line between political necessity and metaphysical truth had become impossible to cleanly draw. And in the center of all this stood Guilliman, perhaps the loneliest mind in the galaxy. Other men were lonely because they lacked company. Guilliman was lonely because no company could safely share the shape of his thoughts. He remembered the old lie. That was what separated him from almost everyone alive. He remembered a time before the cathedral state, before the universal cult, before the species taught itself to interpret every terror through a single holy grammar. He remembered what the emperor had claimed to be building. He remembered the father who condemned worship, the empire that pretended gods were obsolete, the campaign of reason that marched with bolters and orbital annihilation in one hand, and a censored cosmology in the other. Now he governed the inverse of that world. He remembered the lie, and was forced to administer the truth that replaced it, except the truth itself had become intolerable. The old secular order had hidden too much. The new religious order explained too much and understood almost nothing. Between those two abysses stood Guilliman alone, bearing memories no crowd could share and suspicions no council could survive hearing in full. He thought sometimes that silence was the last burden his father had truly left him. Not command, not empire, silence. The silence to watch priests crown a corpse with suns and thunder and not denounce them, because to do so would shatter more than it healed. The silence to observe miracles and refuse both the priest's interpretation and the comfort of dismissal. The silence to see that the ecclesiarchy might be the engine of a transformation rather than the mere vandal of an older truth. The silence to govern a civilization built on a contradiction so fundamental that naming it aloud could trigger another age of heresy. That silence was not cowardice. Guilliman despised cowardice too thoroughly to mistake restraint for it. He held his tongue because he had measured the alternatives and found them worse. In some darker, more private corner of his thought, he had begun to suspect that truth itself had become a weapon too destructive for the Imperium to survive. The species was weak enough to need its myths. The Empire was damaged enough to rely on the very delusions that degraded it. And the being on the throne, whatever he had once been and whatever he was becoming, might now be inseparable from those delusions. So Guilliman said nothing. Not because ignorance was noble, because truth, in this age, might be fatal. Robert Guilliman hid the truth first, because he understood consequence better than faith ever could. There were revelations that liberated. There were revelations that purified. There were revelations that armed a people against delusion and set them upon firmer ground. This was not such a revelation. This was the kind that shattered load-bearing walls in the middle of a siege, the kind that turned unity into doctrinal frenzy, discipline into theological bloodletting, and the machinery of survival into 1,000 mutually exclusive crusades. If Guilliman stood before the High Lords, the Ecclesiarch, the Masters of the Inquisition, the Fabricator General, the Chapter Masters, the Cardinal Worlds, the Shrine Worlds, the Pilgrim Hosts, the Confessor Legions, the Fleet Pulpits, and the corpse-choked Hive Cathedra of the Imperium, and spoke plainly what he feared to be true, the result would not be enlightenment. It would be detonation. If he declared that the Emperor was not merely worshipped as a god, but was in truth becoming a warp power shaped by 10,000 years of devotion, sacrifice, and species-wide dependence, the ecclesiarchy would not respond with serene doctrinal adjustment. It would split down every hidden seam at once. Half its priesthood would cry triumph and claim that the final vindication of the faith had at last been spoken by the Emperor's own son. The other half, or something near it, would recoil in horror at the implication that the divine center of mankind could be spoken of in the same ontological language as the abominations of the immaterium. They would call it slander. They would call it temptation. They would call it the final cunning lie of the ruinous powers. Cathedrals would become fortresses. Cardinals would denounce one another from opposing pulpits, while pilgrim mobs hacked themselves apart beneath saint banners. Whole synods would burn. Whole planetary populations would divide according to which version of blasphemy they preferred. The Inquisition would fare no better. There were inquisitors who would kill him for saying it, if they believed they could. There were others who would kneel in horrified recognition, because their private studies had already brought them close enough to the precipice to know the abyss by scent. Others still would immediately turn the statement into a weapon against rivals, launching purges not to protect the Imperium, but to seize authorship of the new orthodoxy before anyone else could define it. Ordo fought Ordo often enough when the matters at hand were smaller. On a truth of this scale, they would convulse like a body taking poison. Entire conclaves would collapse into factional murder. Some would insist the Emperor's transformation proved the Imperium sanctified beyond all doubt. Others would say it proved that humanity had become the very thing it once swore to destroy. None of them would remain still. And beneath those institutions, the worlds themselves would split. There were planets where the Emperor was already worshipped not merely as guardian, but as consuming flame, warfather, judge of the dead, light beyond the veil, and lord of martyrdom. To such populations, Guilliman's declaration would sound like glorious confirmation. Their faith would sharpen into apocalyptic zeal. They would not hear caution. They would hear coronation. They would pour themselves into worship with even greater ferocity, convinced the final divine unfolding had begun and that their agony had at last found perfect purpose. But on other worlds, especially those where the old poison of forbidden learning still survived in hidden archives, among suspicious adepts, among certain chapters, among the coldest and most disciplined remnants of older thought, the same revelation would be interpreted as damnation. Proof, they would say, that the Imperium had become a devotional prison, feeding its ruler into the very metaphysical category he once opposed. Both reactions would be correct enough to kill millions. That was the first layer, the obvious one, the practical statecraft. Guilliman knew it as surely as he knew how many void ships could be provisioned from a dying Forge world before the transport lanes collapsed. He did not hold his silence because he lacked courage to speak. He held it because he could see the immediate geometry of ruin speech would create. Truth had never been a free act in the Imperium. It had logistical consequences. It moved armies. It altered tithe flows. It redirected pilgrim masses. It reclassified sanctity and treason in the span of a single transmitted decree. The larger the truth, the larger the blast radius. Yet practical consequence alone did not account for his silence. There was another, uglier reason. Guilliman did not fully understand the process he feared. He saw the outline. He saw the shape of accumulation. He saw the terrible symmetry between the powers of the warp and the being upon the throne. He saw that prayer seemed to carry force, that martyrdom seemed to gather meaning beyond morale, that the Emperor's interventions had become too numerous and too pointed to dismiss as mere residual emanation from a dying psychic giant. He saw the cult functioning not only as social glue, but as some deeper kind of engine. He saw the possibility that the old nightmare of the Dark King had not been extinguished, only deferred and transmuted, but the completed picture remained hidden. He did not know whether the Emperor was becoming a god in some wholly unprecedented manner, whether he had already crossed the threshold and only the language lagged behind, whether the throne imprisoned a transformation as much as it sustained one, or whether all of Guilliman's conclusions, though dreadful and coherent, still mistook one category of horror for another. That uncertainty mattered. A lesser mind might have mistaken conviction for comprehension and spoken too soon. Guilliman was not lesser. He understood that there were truths which, once uttered, could not be recalled. To proclaim a theory of this magnitude without absolute command of its mechanisms would be to invite not merely chaos, but interpretation. Interpretation was deadlier than ignorance in a civilization already starved for stable metaphysical language. If he spoke now, millions of minds more deranged, more zealous, more frightened, and more power-hungry than his own would rush to complete the picture for him. They would build dogmas in the gaps. They would write liturgies into the uncertainties. They would make the unknown itself into sacrament. That thought haunted him more than any direct revolt. For there were times, in the deepest privacy of his thought, when Guilliman feared that speaking the truth aloud might not merely describe the process, it might accelerate it. Belief had force. He could no longer pretend otherwise. Name and narrative carried power in the warp, especially when uttered by figures of immense symbolic gravity. What would happen if the Primarch returned from death, Lord Commander of the Imperium, son of the Emperor, architect of countless crusades, stood before mankind, and publicly gave theological shape to the thing currently coiling half-recognized through 1 trillion shrines and battle prayers? Would he be warning the species, or focusing it? Would he be unveiling the danger, or providing the final conceptual vessel into which faith could pour itself with renewed unanimity? He did not know. That ignorance was intolerable enough that he dared not experiment. He had already seen what happened when ideas aligned across enough minds. Whole subsectors moved according to shared myth. Fleets held together under conditions that should have torn them apart, because every crew member believed the same sacred story about endurance and service. Saints emerged because populations expected sainthood to be possible. The warp did not merely prey upon thought, it organized around repeated forms of thought. Thus, a declaration from Guilliman could become more than political crisis. It could become liturgical ignition. And so secrecy itself had become governance. He despised that realization because it smelled so strongly of his father and of Malcador both. Yet he could not escape it. To rule the Imperium was no longer only to command armies, regulate tithes, discipline nobility, and redirect crusades. It was to manage revelation as a strategic resource. Some truths had to be rationed. Some had to be buried. Some had to be delayed until conditions changed, or until there was no longer any choice. Guilliman had become curator of silence. He chose what the Imperium could survive knowing and what it could not. He did so not because he believed ignorance virtuous, but because a state already built atop lies and devotions could not be abruptly relieved of its most structurally important illusions without falling inward. This was the tragedy at the center of him. A rational being forced to preserve superstition because superstition had become operational reality. He had not been bred for this. He had been bred to build order from matter, law from confusion, victory from competent force applied with intelligence and speed. Yet here he was, preserving mystery, allowing shrines to stand, tolerating miracle language in war reports, permitting cathedra and processions and saint cults to continue, because the state now rested on them as surely as it rested on agri shipments and munitions flow. The superstition no longer merely decorated power. It generated obedience, morale, sacrifice, and perhaps even the active force of the emperor himself. To tear it down might be morally satisfying for a brief and glorious instant. It would also kill the Imperium. There was, too, the personal wound. To admit fully that the emperor had perhaps engineered the heresy in broad design, and now perhaps rose through the very flood of faith born from that disaster, would mean admitting that his father's great project had been both failure and success at once. The secular dream failed. The rational Imperium failed. The promise that mankind might be dragged into safety through denial of the divine failed. Yet the centralization succeeded. The concentration of species loyalty succeeded. The enthronement of one absolute human locus of dependence succeeded. The making of mankind into a civilization with one devotional center succeeded with a completeness no great crusade decree ever approached. To hold all those truths together was to realize that the emperor may have lost the form of his project while preserving its deepest and most terrible aim. Guilliman did not know whether he could ever forgive that. Nor did he know what such knowledge would do to every institution tied to legitimacy if it were publicly acknowledged. What became of the Primarch legacy if the Primarchs were revealed not as glorious sons betrayed by tragic fortune, but as weapons built for a project that may have required fratricide? What became of the codified post-heresy settlement, the chapter divisions, the structures of command, the inherited moral authority of terror, if all of it rested atop a deeper concealed sacrificial design? What became of loyalty itself when the father at the center of the species was understood not merely as savior or tyrant, but as a being who may have used catastrophe to shape the conditions of his own becoming? No empire survives such questions cleanly. Sometimes Guilliman allowed himself a smaller, sadder motive as well. Not certainty, but hope. Hope not in salvation, which he had outgrown before his first death, but in error. The possibility that there remained another explanation, a better arrangement of the facts, some hidden factor not yet recovered from the sealed past, some unknown principle governing the throne that would render his darkest conclusions partially mistaken. Even he, with all his hard-boned discipline, would rather inhabit uncertainty than accept with full finality that the species he now governed had spent 10,000 years making a warp god of its own emperor and calling the process holy necessity. That hope did not rule him, but it lingered. It lingered in the spaces where he chose silence over declaration. In the moments when he read another sealed account of miracle and set it aside rather than ordering immediate, doctrinal war. In the nights when he stood before the glass of some palace height, looking down on processions of fire and bone, and wondered whether he preserved the lie because it was useful, or because some final part of him still wanted his father to be less monstrous than the evidence suggested. Either way, the result was the same. He kept the secret. Not perfectly, for no secret in the Imperium remained wholly contained. Fragments leaked, suspicions bred. Certain inquisitors watched him with too much intelligence. Certain cardinals preached too close to the dangerous edge. Certain scholars in hidden cells of terror assembled their own maps from censored debris. But the central recognition remained locked behind his teeth. He would not be the one to give it clean public form. That was the deepest irony of all, and it tasted of ash every time he let himself look at it directly. Guilliman hid the truth because the Imperium was too religious to survive hearing what religion had done to its god. There were nights in the sanctum above the throne when Robert Guilliman could almost believe his father had planned even this. Not the details. Not the ruin in all its particulars. Not the precise arrangement of corpses, cathedrals, star forts, corpse-starch empires, pilgrim tides, shrieking cardinals, and blind saint processions that now defined mankind's dominion. No mind, not even the emperor's, could have drawn every line of so vast a degradation with perfect exactitude. But the shape of it, the direction, the terrible utility of a species bound by terror and faith to one central will, that, Guilliman feared, might not be accident at all. He had long since abandoned the consolation that the Golden Throne represented only defeat prolonged. That was how the simpler minds of the Imperium preferred to think of it. The Emperor wounded unto death by his fallen son, enthroned in living martyrdom, preserving mankind through unending agony, while his faithful servants held the line until the last battle of all things. There was comfort in that myth. It preserved the moral geometry of sacrifice. It allowed the species to imagine the throne as a vigil rather than a process, a wound rather than a transformation. Guilliman no longer trusted wounds that lasted 10,000 years. Too much had happened in that span. Too many miracles. Too many signs of active pressure from the throneward soul fire. Too many saints igniting across the dark like living votive flames. Too many moments where impossible providence broke into battlefields already lost, as though something on terror were pressing back through the veil with a growing impatience. A dying ruler might endure. A martyr might radiate. But endurance and radiance did not fully account for what the Imperium had become around him. No. The more Guilliman thought upon it, the less the post-heresy age resembled simple aftermath. It resembled incubation. That was the word he hated most, because it forced all the pieces into a coherently obscene arrangement. If the Emperor had indeed stood upon the brink of one kind of godhood during the heresy and stepped back from it, then the question was not merely why he refused. The question was what he preferred instead. Refusal only mattered when measured against another path. A man did not recoil from one crown unless he believed another might yet be claimed. Perhaps that had always been the real difference. The Emperor had not rejected becoming a god in absolute moral disgust. He had rejected becoming one on the warp's timetable, under the gaze of the Four, in the middle of terror's butchery, shaped by chaos-favorable conditions and crowned in the blood steam of humanity's most uncontrolled catastrophe. That form of ascension would have been corruption through victory stolen at the wrong hour. A black enthronement in the enemy's image, even if it wore the Emperor's face. The Dark King, if that title meant anything, coherent at all, was not merely a name for power. It was a name for power seized under poisoned conditions. So he refused, or delayed. And if he delayed, then everything after took on a new and ghastly logic. The long game was never resurrection in the crude sense the ecclesiarchy imagined. Guilliman had come to despise that word as deeply as he despised the sermons that used it. Resurrection suggested restoration. The old self returned, the same hand reaching back from beyond loss to reclaim the scepter. But no one who had stood within range of the throne's impossible pressure could still believe such childish things. Whatever the Emperor was becoming, it would not simply stand up from the machine as the same sovereign who once walked the halls of the Great Crusade, draped in reason and gold. It would be transformation first, then re-entry. A re-entry timed not to the end of the heresy, but to a later age when humanity had become desperate enough, devout enough, and psychically primed enough to sustain the kind of presence the Emperor may always have needed in order to return on his own terms. That was the genius of it, if genius and monstrosity could still be separated at this altitude of thought. The heresy had failed to crown him properly because it was too wild, too contaminated, too immediate, too dominated by the pressure of the Four. The later Imperium corrected those conditions. It made suffering orderly. It made worship universal. It made sacrifice continuous. It took the chaos of a single great apocalypse and stretched it into a controlled atmosphere of devotion, lasting millennia. The Golden Throne stood at the center of that atmosphere like a seed in iron soil, not merely preserving the Emperor, cultivating him. The machine anchored terror. That much was beyond dispute. It held back catastrophes only a handful of living beings even partially understood. It sustained the Astronomicon. It devoured psychers by the thousand and translated their agonized dissolution into continuance. It acted as prison, beacon, life support, soul engine, and metaphysical rampart all at once. Yet Guilliman no longer believed those functions exhausted its purpose. They described what the throne did. not necessarily what it was for. A cocoon did not cease being a cocoon because it also protected what grew within. And across the 10,000 years of the throne era, what had been assembled around it? Exactly the conditions a returning warp sovereign would require. Endless prayer, endless sacrifice, endless war. A trillion souls emotionally chained to one divine center. The modern Imperium was grotesquely perfect for such a re-emergence. It was not a civilization in the old political sense, not really. It was a devotional habitat. Every world tithed bodies, belief, or both. Every battle was framed liturgically. Every miracle story spread along trade routes and pilgrim roads faster than law or reform ever could. Children were raised on the certainty that only the Emperor stood between their souls and oblivion. Soldiers were trained to offer their deaths upward as payment. Astropaths screamed themselves into usefulness beneath his light. Navigators sailed by his agony. Shrine worlds metabolized mass grief into tourism, martyr economies, and ritualized surrender. Whole planetary cultures existed primarily to adore, feed, and interpret the same enthroned absence presence on Terra. It was impossible not to see design there once one permitted the thought to form. Not the design of every governor, cardinal, or high lord. Most of them were vermin, opportunists, zealots, or bureaucratic livestock, but design at the civilizational level. The species had become arranged around one central act of psychic dependence. Everything flowed inward. Everything sought validation from the same source. The Imperium had accidentally or deliberately built the perfect cradle for the second birth of its god. Guilliman found himself returning again and again to the saints, not because he loved them. He distrusted all sanctity that could not survive scrutiny, but because they were the most difficult phenomena to explain if one wished to preserve the old categories. Some appeared like fever dreams made flesh, shattering the morale geometry of a battle by their mere arrival. Some blazed briefly and burned out, leaving only ash, relics, and a generation of new pilgrims. Some lingered longer, carrying impossible resilience, impossible insight, impossible authority over the fearful minds around them. The ecclesiarchy called them blessings. The Ordo Hereticus called them weapons of faith. The masses called them proof. Guilliman began to suspect they were probes, test pulses, not random miracles dropping from an unchanged heaven, but outward thrusts from a consciousness pressing against the limits of its current confinement. Exploratory movements, controlled manifestations, a vast will learning how to touch the material realm more directly through receptive flesh, heightened devotion, and moments of crisis dense enough to bear the contact. If so, then every saint might be less a gift than an instrument reading the boundary between what the Emperor was now and what he would one day be able to become in full. The same possibility haunted the visions. Astropaths, who should have shared nothing describing identical fires. Dying soldiers glimpsing a throne of impossible magnitude before their hearts stopped. Ecclesiarchal fanatics who walked from cataleptic trance with fragments of instruction too timely to dismiss. Navigators swearing that the beacon sometimes narrowed, focused, regarded. Guilliman had learned to mistrust all private revelation on principle, yet the repetition of these events across distance and circumstance wore down even his iron refusal. A pattern existed. Something was pressing outward through the veil, separating corpse, machine, warp, and empire. But what would emerge if the pressure finally broke through? That was the question no prayer could answer. Would it be the Emperor, or a new entity wearing the Emperor's identity like a crown? Guilliman could not make himself believe that continuity of name guaranteed continuity of self. Too much changes when beings enter the warp and are reflected back through its impossible logic. Even the Primarchs had been altered by less. What then of a sovereign enthroned for 10 millennia at the center of the species' faith, fed by sacrifice, broadened by psychic scale beyond anything human language was built to contain? If that being returned to active history, would it still be father in any meaningful sense? Would it still be king, statesman, tyrant, visionary? Or would it be something altogether new, clothed in his memory, wielding his symbols, bearing his authority, yet no more reducible to the old emperor than a star was reducible to the first spark that birthed it? That thought made every pious hope in the Imperium look like bait. The Dark King returned to him then, always. Not as a final resolved certainty, but as a key that fit too many locks. Perhaps the Emperor never rejected godhood as such. Perhaps he rejected only one version of it, the rushed version, the chaos-mediated version, the version born from defeat, frenzy, and an uncontrolled ritual storm at the end of the heresy. He would not become the warp's fifth throne under their conditions. He would not rise in their image. He would not let the species' despair crown him, while the four stood nearest to shape the result. So he chose another road, a longer road, a road built from controlled devotion rather than total collapse, from civilizational conditioning rather than battlefield overload, from organized sacrifice, ritual continuity, and species-wide centralization. Not a human god born from sudden apocalypse, but humanity's own catastrophic warp sovereign ripened through order, pain, and endless need. Something no less terrible for being more stable, perhaps more terrible because of that stability. Guilliman could think of nothing more unbearable. He was fighting every day to preserve mankind from extinction. That was the work placed in his hands, whether by fate, father, or the blind machinery of history. He fought to keep worlds from falling, supply lines from snapping, fleets from being swallowed, sectors from turning cannibal in the dark. He fought so that children on 1,000,000 poison worlds could live one more winter, so that defenders on 1,000 walls could fire one more hour, so that the Imperium might remain ugly and breathing rather than glorious and dead. And all the while he feared that mankind itself had been arranged as fuel, not merely governed, not merely protected, arranged to feed a second birth, every martyr a morsel, every prayer a thread, every war a contraction in the hidden womb of empire. This was the true obscenity beneath all the rest. Not that the Emperor might return, but that his return might require exactly the conditions Guilliman was laboring to preserve. The continuation of the Imperium meant the continuation of the process. The salvation of humanity, in the immediate material sense, might simultaneously be the nourishment of the thing that would eventually eclipse humanity's old categories of sovereignty and divinity alike. He could neither abandon the species, nor free it from the machine that seemed to be using it. There was no lever to pull, no reform broad enough, no military victory clean enough to break the circle. He stood instead, inside the circle, and kept it turning. Sometimes, in his most private and exhausted thoughts, he imagined what the moment of return would look like, not as the priest painted it. No radiant king walking unblemished from the throne to cast down the enemies of man in a storm of golden justice. Reality would not indulge such pageantry honestly. No, it would be stranger, more terrible. The veil would tremble. The Astronomicon might flare beyond all navigable tolerances. Saints would ignite or perish by the thousand. Whole worlds might fall to their knees without understanding why. Warp routes would convulse. Demons would scream in ecstasy or terror. The throne might crack. Terror itself might become the axis of some new order of reality. And from that rupture, something would emerge that every man, woman, child, mutant, priest, inquisitor, soldier, navigator, and king in the Imperium would call the Emperor because they would have no other word. But words were not safeguards. A thing called the Emperor might save the Imperium. It might also consume it, absorb it, fix it forever in the devotional architecture that birthed him, and make permanent the union of empire, worship, and suffering that currently still wore the mask of necessity. Guilliman could not tell which outcome was more likely, and that was the final terror waiting at the end of all. His thought: if the Emperor returns, will he save the Imperium? Or will he complete it into something far more terrible and far more eternal than mankind was ever meant to endure? Robout Guilliman stood alone, where the light of the Astronomicon bled faintly through stone older than empires, and listened to the sound of the Imperium breathing. It never truly fell silent. Even here, in one of the sealed upper galleries cut deep into the palace's impossible mass, there was no stillness untouched by human need. Far below, beneath layered bastions, shrine vaults, audience halls, reliquary crypts, dock fortresses, and the cathedral arteries through which terror fed itself upon devotion, the species made noise for its god. Pilgrims chanted, engines roared, processional bells tolled. Vox choirs carried litanies across distances so vast that the echoes returned altered, like prayers translated through age and steel. Warships climbed from orbital spines bearing shrines in their hulls, and confessionals beside their magazines. Black ships descended with their harvest of the doomed. Adepts scratched another night of decrees into vellum and copper and data slates. Somewhere on some wall, a regiment swore oaths before deployment. Somewhere in the underhives, a child learned the Emperor's name before he learned the names of the stars. Somewhere in the chapel-choked darkness of a void ship, men who would never see terror whispered to him anyway, and called that whisper hope. This was the sound of mankind persisting. This was also the sound of a machine being fed. Guilliman had enough evidence now to fear. That was the marrow of it. Not enough certainty to stand before the Imperium and confess the shape of his thought as if it were a finished doctrine carved into adamant. Never that. He was not priest enough to mistake suspicion for revelation, nor fool enough to imagine that all mysteries yielded to command merely because he was a Primarch. Too much remained obscured. Too much had been burned, buried, compartmentalized, or worn smooth by 10,000 years of devotional misuse. Yet he had enough fragments, enough contradictions, enough recurring patterns, enough impossible survivals, forbidden implications, and dreadful symmetries to know that ignorance had become a pose he could no longer wear in private. He also had no safe audience. That perhaps was the final cruelty. There were men in the Imperium intelligent enough to understand portions of the danger, but none who could hear the whole shape without either weaponizing it, worshipping it, or breaking under its weight. The ecclesiarchy would crown it. The Inquisition would vivisect it. The High Lords would use it until it consumed them. The chapters would divide around it according to their own old loyalties, pride, and fear. The common multitudes would do what frightened masses always did when handed truth too large for ordinary life. They would turn it into myth before the day was out, and then kill one another over which myth was purest. So Guilliman kept his counsel and let his mind return once more to the chain he could no longer unsee. The Primarchs, warp-touched from conception, not merely generals, but engineered concentrations of magnified human principle. The scattering, not only theft, but repercussion, as though something beyond the veil had reached to unmake a design by forcing each son into the harshest soil for his nature. The Great Crusade, outwardly rational and inwardly riddled with controlled contradiction. The heresy, perhaps anticipated in broad catastrophe, if not in exact hour or form, a possible civil purge turned to species endangering inferno when the true enemy moved sooner and more violently than the Emperor intended. The Dark King, that shadowed possibility hanging over terror's last nights, not just a name, but a station of horror waiting to be occupied beneath the right pressure. The refusal at the end, if refusal it had been, lesser, rejection of godhood itself than of godhood under hostile terms, in the enemy's image and on the enemy's clock. Then the throne, the long enthronement, the corpse that was no corpse, the sovereign reduced and expanded at once, decaying in matter while growing in effect. The Astronomicon blazing, the miracles multiplying, the saints appearing like stress fractures in reality, the cult spreading not as wisdom, but as infection, the species binding itself, generation by generation, to one enthroned center of all fear, hope, sacrifice, and obedience. Faith becoming fuel, suffering becoming ritual, survival becoming dependency, silence becoming policy, Every road led back to the same precipice. That was what it meant, in the end, when he admitted to himself that he knew. Not knowledge in the petty legal sense, not the certainty of a tribunal verdict, or the sterile satisfaction of a completed proof. Not knowledge one could set before an assembly and demand assent to on the strength of evidence neatly ordered. Something deeper and colder than that. The kind of knowing born when every surviving path of inference bends toward the same abyss. When too many independent truths converge. When no alternative explanation remains broad enough to absorb the facts without leaving behind more monstrosity than it resolves. Guilliman knew because all roads now pointed to the same horrifying conclusion, and because no other conclusion was growing smaller as the years passed. The Imperium survived by useful fictions. It always had, though in the old days, its fictions wore cleaner armor. During the Great Crusade, the lie had been reason. The Emperor denied gods while waging secret war against powers he understood better than any man alive. The species was told it marched toward enlightenment while whole categories of truth were withheld, lest they detonate the future. Now the lie was holiness. Mankind was told it served a pure and sacred order, while that order fed upon its blood, its fear, and perhaps its souls. In patterns no catechism could honestly describe. One fiction replaced another. One mask cracked, another was hammered into place. The need beneath them never changed. Human beings required a story large enough to carry them through the dark. To his enduring disgust, Guilliman had become one of the chief custodians of those stories. He who had once measured empires in logistics, compliance patterns, reserve fleets, codified law, grain yield, transport corridors, and disciplined civic force now spent as much effort preserving narrative load-bearing structures as he did any munitions chain. He allowed cult and shrine and saint. He tolerated miracle language in after-action reports if it preserved morale and prevented schism. He restrained the ecclesiarchy when it overreached, but never so hard that the whole edifice cracked. He governed not only men and fleets, but revelation itself. He rationed truth because truth had become more destructive than artillery. This, more than war, felt like corruption. Yet perhaps it had always been the way of the far future. Truth in the Imperium was never merely discovered. It was bludgeoned into myth, and once myth took hold strongly enough, it ceased being story and became machinery. It shaped movement, obedience, sacrifice, legitimacy. It determined where armies marched and which worlds starved patiently rather than revolt. It told mothers what to teach, soldiers how to die, navigators where to trust the light, and inquisitors what shape of terror was permissible. Myth became infrastructure. Infrastructure became faith. Faith became force. How else could a species build a god engine without first teaching itself to kneel? That was the final inversion of the Emperor's dream, the one that lodged like frozen iron in Guilliman's thoughts and would not dissolve. The species was to be freed from gods. That had been the public shape of the labor, however fraudulent or incomplete. No more chains of worship. No more surrender to the unseen. No more cosmic tyrannies fattened upon human awe and agony. The Emperor would cut mankind loose from such dependencies and make it sovereign in its own right. Instead, mankind had built the largest apparatus of divine dependence in its history around his corpse. Not a temple, an engine. A civilization-wide mechanism for the collection and redirection of prayer, fear, martyrdom, obedience, and metaphysical need toward a single central presence. The old gods of the warp had emerged from the psychic excess of vast populations over ages uncounted. The Imperium, in its terror and discipline, had refined that process into something almost industrial. The result might be nobler in symbol, more ordered in form, more human in language. It might also be no less catastrophic for all that. Guilliman could not even hate the people for it. That was another blade in the wound. The horror was not one secret act, not one cabal, not one betrayal, isolated in time. It was a process. 10,000 years of participation by billions who understood none of it in full and could scarcely be blamed for trying to survive the only way their age allowed. Pilgrims crawling on bleeding knees to shrine gates. Guardsmen whispering prayers into mud because something in the dark was trying to wear their comrades' skins. Navigators clinging to the beacon like children to a father's hand. Mothers teaching catechisms beside hab furnaces. Ministorum preachers roaring hope into worlds that would otherwise drown in despair. Even the cruelest rites often had desperation at their core. The Imperium was not filled only with hypocrites and fanatics. It was filled with frightened souls making meaning where none survivable existed unless made. That was why the thing endured. And that was why Guilliman's true burden was not war. War at least permitted action. War could be answered with deployment, discipline, adaptation, annihilation, reinforcement, sacrifice directed toward visible ends. Guilliman understood war. He had been born to it and remade by it twice over. What crushed him now was waiting. Waiting to see whether the pressure gathering around the throne would one day rupture into open return. Waiting to see whether his father would emerge as savior, tyrant, or something beyond both categories. Something for which the old vocabulary of loyalty and rebellion would be pitifully inadequate. Waiting to see whether every reform he enacted, every crusade he ordered, every world he saved, every institution he preserved, was also another turn of the wheel feeding the transformation he most feared. Waiting was worse than battle because battle at least shed uncertainty and blood. He looked down from the gallery and saw, through layers of haze and distance, the crawling lines of nocturnal processions moving like embers through the colossal avenues below. Terror screamed devotion even when it whispered. Somewhere, beneath all that noise, sat the throne. Somewhere beneath all that light, sat the ruined shape of the Emperor. Somewhere beyond matter, perhaps wrapped around it already, perhaps still forming, perhaps merely waiting for one final convergence of faith and need. There was something vast enough that even Guilliman's prodigious mind could only approach it in fragments. He thought of speaking sometimes. Not often, but enough to wound. To gather a council of those rare few whose minds might endure some portion of the truth. To lay out the chain, the Primarch bargain, the anticipated heresy, the Dark King avoided, the throne as cocoon and altar, the cult as engine, the return as possible culmination rather than rescue. To ask aloud what he had asked only in silence for so long. And every time he imagined it, he saw only fracture, no revelation, no cleansing, no liberation. Only more machinery built from panic, more myths hammered into place, more blood. So he remained what history had, made him, a silent Primarch ruling a screaming empire, knowing that if he spoke too much he might shatter it, and if he said nothing he might merely help the transformation continue. He did not hide the truth because it was unbelievable. He hid it because somewhere in the coldest chambers of his private thought he feared it was already happening.